society and culture, politics, science, math, and the rest. That's an interesting enterprise. She went to, I think, Williams College. Is that, Barbara?
Yes.
Are you Williams College?
Right.
And then she also got a master's degree in legal studies at Yale University, partly because she was working in the area of justice and the prison systems early in her commentating career. She has the interesting enterprise with church people of interfacing faith and work and society every single day of her life. She has written a very important book, Fingerprints of God, as faith interacts with those various disciplines that I just mentioned. I hope you'll see her book. It's in our bookshop. You may get it on Google or any number of ways to get your hands on her work. You can listen to her, we hope, day by day on National Public Radio. Let's welcome Barbara Bradley Hagerty. She's up
Thank you. Wonderful.
I'll watch the prayer.
No, that's it. Great.
Well, welcome.
Thank you. Good morning.
Good morning.
Can everyone hear me?
Yeah.
Can the microphones, I have this jet pack here, so if I fly off, you know that someone hit the ignition. Okay, so if everyone can hear me, thank you. Thank you for that introduction, and I confess I always feel a little bit old when I hear kind of the number of stories I've done, or how long I've been doing radio and journalism, 30 years actually, and I kind of think, how on earth did I get to this place? But I also feel very, very privileged to be able to report on really, really important questions, especially at NPR. I've been able to think about big ideas. I know very few other media organizations that'll let you think about big ideas like the roots of terrorism, or the way faith shapes our politics, or the biggest questions of all, like God and science, and whether we can know if there's more than this material human existence. And that's what I got to do for both NPR and for my book. This morning what I want to do is tease out a couple of those big questions. Is there any evidence for God or a spiritual dimension? Is there any evidence that exists? And what happens when you try to scientifically examine spiritual experience? First, if I may, I want to give you a little bit of a background as to why I wrote Fingerprints of God. Essentially, I wrote this book because I had one pressing question. Am I crazy? Am I absolutely nuts? See, back in 1995, I was doing a story for the LA Times Sunday magazine. And the story was on why some churches grow and other churches don't grow. And one of the churches that I was profiling was a then unknown church called Saddleback Community Church. Rick Warren's church, right? Everyone knows him now. And I went out there for a Saturday night service, and I was interviewing people. And one of the people I interviewed was a woman named Kathy Young. And I sat with her during the service, and after the service we went out and we sat on a park bench, and she told me about her spiritual journey. And she told me about how she had gotten melanoma in her 20s, but that it had gone into remission and now it had returned. And she found Saddleback around that time, and what she said is she told me that she thought God had allowed the melanoma to return, not to kill her, but to give her a transcendent purpose. And I want to set the scene here. We were sitting on a bench under a street light, and it had grown dark, and it felt as if we were actors on a circular stage, right? And as Kathy talked, something very strange happened. The air grew moist and warm. It was as if someone were breathing on us. It was visceral. I mean, it hit me, and I looked over at Kathy, and she had stopped talking because she felt it too. And we just sat there for 30, 40 seconds. It seemed like a really long time. And then the kind of sensation of someone breathing on us, this warmth, just ebbed. And I looked at Kathy and I said, well, Kathy, it's been so nice talking to you. I need to go back to LA right now, and so I'll stay in touch, okay? And so I hightailed it out there as quickly as I could because I was really, really spooked. Nothing like that had ever happened to me. And as I drove back from Orange County to LA, I wondered, what happened in that moment? I mean, was it a delusion? Was it unusual electrical firings in my temporal lobe? Was I crazy? Or is it possible that there is a God or some force that on occasion steps into the circle of light and breathes on you? I thought about this for several years. It was actually a turning point in the way I thought about life. But I didn't really get a chance to do anything about it. Didn't get a chance to answer any of those questions because I really couldn't see a rigorous way to tackle the questions until one day in, I think it was May of 2001, I read a Newsweek article on Neuro Theology. Does anyone remember reading that article? It was a cover story. And basically Neuro Theology, well, at places like the University of Wisconsin and the University of Pennsylvania, scientists were studying nuns and monks and putting them in a brain scanner and trying to, when they were at the height of their spiritual experience, and they were trying to see what a spiritual experience looks like as it unfolds in the brain. I thought, wow, you know what? Scientists are really trying to get a handle on what spiritual experience is, what it looks like, how it proceeds. So I decided to look into the research, see if there was any more research on this, and to write a book. Now, let me say at the outset that the science of spirituality is extremely preliminary. I mean, for one thing, there isn't much funding. Research centers would rather find the cure for medicine than discover whether there is a God or not. I mean, that's where the cure for cancer rather than finding out whether there's a God or not. But, and also for most of this century, science would not touch spiritual experience. I mean, when I wrote this book, there was a survey of the country's most elite scientists, and 93% of them said that they did not believe in God. It's an astonishing figure, given that about 90% of Americans say they do believe in God. It's the obverse. So the question is, why should scientists spend time investigating something that they believe is an illusion? But something's changed in recent years that has made this research a little bit more urgent. For one thing, science has created the brain imaging technology so that we can actually peer into our brains. And that makes it theoretically possible to observe a spiritual experience in the brain. Moreover, it turns out that spiritual experience is incredibly common. I mean, according to the National Opinion Research Center, a poll by the University of Chicago, and another poll by Pew Research Center, fully half of Americans have had a transformative spiritual experience, the kind of experience where you can circle the date on the calendar and say, you know, yep, on March 22, 2002, I had a transcendent experience that made me think differently about the world. Half of people have had that. So, you know, if 50% of Americans had a mysterious disease called, you know, pants on fire disease, you can imagine that scientists would want to study it, right? And spiritual experiences is everywhere. It dramatically changes people. It affects their outlooks on life. And so finally, scientists have begun, a few very brave scientists have begun to start looking at these experiences. And what I wanted to do is see what they were finding. So in 2006, I took a year off to do just that. Now, I want to say that this has been the most fascinating and the most terrifying research that I've done. It's fascinating for obvious reasons, and you're going to find out more in a minute, but it was terrifying because it contained some risks. And one risk it contained was to my reputation. Because early on I decided to weave my own spiritual journey into the research, into the narrative. And, you know, journalists kind of are like anthropologists. If I were to do this from a purely journalistic perspective, it would be like, oh, look at these cute little people who have these religious experiences. Isn't that fun, you know? And investigate them like they were kind of a species of zebra or something. But I didn't want to do that. I wanted to say, look, Mr. and Mrs. Reader, I've actually had a spiritual experience. I know where you're coming from. I have the time to research these questions that you may have, and so why don't you let me do it? But in doing so, I made it extremely personal. You know, I wondered what my colleagues at NPR would say. NPR reporters are not many of them say go to the Southern Baptist Convention, right? So I was a little nervous about what my colleagues would say. So I was worried about that, but the second concern was even more troubling. What if God is a sham, right? What if I found in my reporting that God is nothing more than brain chemistry? What do I do then? But I was so curious about the questions that I decided that I would go ahead and plunge in and do the research. Now, my search took me to a Navajo peyote ceremony, to Ontario, Canada, where I donned the God helmet. I hope someone asks me about that later. It took me to Wisconsin, where I tried my hand at meditation and found that I have absolutely no aptitude for quiet reflection. I attended a conference of near-death research at MD Anderson around here in Houston, where I could talk to some 300 people who had had near-death experiences, and let me tell you, that was a trip. And of course, I talked with countless scientists, and these were the questions I tried to tackle. Is there a God gene? Is there a God chemical? Is there a God spot in the brain? Are the brains of spiritual virtuosos, those who pray and meditate for long periods of time each day, are their brains different from yours and mine? Does prayer heal not just my body, but another person's body? And can consciousness operate when the brain is offline? So in my time today, I'd like to zero in on 3 of those questions and basically just tell you some stories. The first question I wanted to tackle involves the God spot in the brain. Is there an area of the brain that mediates or handles spiritual experience, what people feel during these transcendent moments? And if you can find the place that mediates these moments, these spiritual experiences, then is God nothing more than brain tissue? People have long suspected that the temporal lobe has something to do with religious experience. The temporal lobe runs along the side of the brain, and the temporal limbic system handles not just sound and smell, but some vision and memory and emotion. And the first concrete piece of evidence that there might be a connection between spirituality and the temporal lobe was made by a Canadian neurosurgeon named Wilder Penfield. Has anyone heard of him? Yeah. He, back in the 1940s and 1950s, he began mucking around in the brains of people while he operated on them. You see, there aren't any pain receptors in the brain, and so he could go into the brain and touch various parts. And what he would do is he'd keep them awake during surgery, and what he would do is he'd poke one part of the brain with an electrode, and they'd tell him where in their body they felt the poke. Right? So he'd poke one part, and they'd say, oh, I feel it in my big toe or my lips. And he actually mapped out the brain and the body, where the body is in the brain, doing this. Well, when he poked the temporal lobe, some people reported having out-of-body experiences, or seeing apparitions, or hearing voices. And he hypothesized that he had found the seat of religious experience in the brain. So scientists figured that one way to look at the brain mechanisms of religious experience is to look at people who have temporal lobe epilepsy, on the theory that, you know, the extreme elucidates the common. So normally temporal lobe epilepsy is an electrical storm in the brain where all the cells fire together, and usually seizures are just horrible things. But in a few rare cases, people have what are called ecstatic seizures. And they believe they are having a religious experience. You know, they may see a glimpse of light and think it's an angel, or they may hear snatches of words or music drawn from their memory bank and interpret them as music from the heavenly spheres or a message from God. So you can probably see where this is going. Today, some neuroscientists believe that some, if not all, of the great religious figures had temporal lobe epilepsy. So, Saul on the road to Damascus, was he blinded by God and did he hear Jesus' voice? Or did he suffer from, quote, visual and auditory hallucinations with photism and transient blindness, as some neuroscientists hypothesize? Did Joseph Smith, the founder of Mormonism, see a pillar of light and two angels, or suffer from a complex partial seizure? What about Moses in that burning bush followed by God's voice? The list includes Muhammad, Buddha, Joan of Arc, Teresa of Avila, the founders of the Shaker movement, the New Jerusalem Church, the Christian Science Church, and Seventh-day Adventists, to name a few. These people all suffered, these experts say, from the sacred disease, from temporal lobe epilepsy. Now, I gotta say, I have a little trouble with this. I mean, it's hard to imagine that something as debilitating as temporal lobe epilepsy would be helpful in, say, writing the bulk of Christian doctrine, as did Paul, or leading a people through the wilderness for 40 years, as did Moses, or founding one of the three great monotheistic religions, as did Muhammad. Still, I do think that scientists are onto something. I think the temporal lobe may, in fact, be a place that mediates religious experience. And the person who kind of persuaded me of this is a guy named Jeff Schimmel. Jeff is a comedy writer in Hollywood. He was raised Jewish, but he never really believed in God, and he didn't have any interest in spirituality whatsoever. And then a few years ago, when he was 40, his doctor found a benign tumor in his left temporal lobe, and they removed it. Now, the surgery was a snap, but soon after that, unbeknownst to Jeff, he began to suffer from mini seizures. He began hearing things and having visions. He remembers one night when he was lying in bed, he looked up at the ceiling and he saw this swirl of blue and gold and green colors that gradually settled into a shape, and he's looking at it and couldn't figure out what it was. And suddenly it dawned on him, it was the Virgin Mary. And he told me, he laughed out loud, he said, why would the Virgin Mary appear to me, a Jewish guy? She could do so much better. So Jeff became fascinated with spirituality. He would weep at the drop of a hat when he saw other people in pain, which actually wasn't helpful as a comedy writer. And he eventually became a devout Buddhist. And I remember when I first talked to him, it was on the phone. I asked him, you know, you're a devout Buddhist, what does that mean? And he goes, well, just for example, I'm sitting here looking at my fireplace and I see 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11 Buddhas on my mantle. He was just fully into it. And he began to wonder, could his new outlook on life have anything to do with his brain? So the next visit to his neurologist, he asked to see his most recent MRI. And sure enough, his temporal lobe had become smaller, it was a different shape, there was scar tissue on it. Those changes had sparked electrical firings in his brain, and Jeff's doctor told him that he had developed temporal lobe epilepsy. There was no question that his newfound faith and his love for mankind came from his brain. Now, Jeff told me that didn't bother him in the least. He said, you know, I don't know why. I don't care why I changed. I don't care how I changed, but I've changed for the better. I'm a happier, better person because of this, and I wouldn't trade it for the world. Still, it begged the question in my mind, are transcendent experiences, not just Jeff Schimmel's, but Teresa of Avila's, are they merely a physiological event? Or does the brain activity reflect an encounter with a spiritual dimension? And I want to propose that how you come down on this issue depends on whether you think of the brain as a CD player or a radio. Okay? Most scientists who believe that everything is explainable through material means think that the brain is a CD player. The content, for example, the song, is playing in a closed system. If you take a hammer to the machine, the song won't play. In other words, there is no song or no God that exists outside of the brain, outside of the CD player, trying to communicate. All spiritual experience, according to this, resides inside the brain. And when you alter the brain, God and spirituality disappear. But suppose the brain is not a CD player. Suppose it's a radio. Now, in this analogy, everyone possesses the neural equipment to receive the radio program in various degrees. So some people have the volume turned down really low. I suspect Richard Dawkins and Sam Harris have hit the mute button. Other people hear their favorite programs every now and again, like most of us, like me, who have brief transcendent experiences. Some people have the volume too high, or it's like they're caught in between. They hear a cacophony of sounds like they're caught in between stations, and these people actually need medical help. But in this analogy, the sender is separate from the receiver. The content of the transmission does not originate in the brain any more than the hosts of all things considered are sitting in your radio. If you destroy the radio, you're not going to hear the shows, but the transmission, the words spoken by Melissa Block and Robert Siegel in Studio 2A, that is still operating. If the brain's the receiver, then theoretically God's communications never stop, even when the brain is altered, even when it stops functioning. So that's not to say that all our thoughts come from another spiritual realm any more than, everything we hear comes from the radio. It means, it suggests, though, that perhaps people who have vivid or frequent transcendent experiences are able to tune in better to this dimension that many of us ignore. I mean, maybe St. Paul and Joan of Arc weren't crazy. Maybe they just have better antenna. Now, another argument that God is all in your head comes from neuropharmacologists. And here we get to what I call the God chemical. They propose that God is nothing more than chemical reactions in your brain. And I remember thinking about this a lot as I sat for 11 hours from 9 p.m. to 8 a.m. on the dirt floor of a teepee and in a Navajo peyote ceremony in Lukachukai, Arizona. Now, there were 30 of us in this ceremony. It was a healing ceremony, and everyone but me had had a whole lot of peyote. I kind of wish it. I was trying to stay straight so I could observe things, but I'll tell you, after a few hours, I was pretty envious of these people because I was in a lot of pain. It's kneeling or sitting cross-legged on this dirt floor, and they seemed to be very happy. They just their heads would just bounce to the beat like bobbleheads. I'm kind of in excruciating pain. But around midnight, the woman for whom the ceremony was taking place thanked us for coming. She said that she had been suffering from shingles for several months, and she said that this ceremony was really so the peyote and the spirit world could heal her. So that was midnight. Around 1 a.m., she confessed that 20 years earlier she had accidentally run over a man on the highway. Now, she believed that he was already dead when she ran over his head, she said. At any rate, she said, a headless man kept appearing to her in her dreams, and she wanted forgiveness, and she wanted the peyote, which the Navajos consider to be kind of the mediator between the spirit world and the human world. She wanted the peyote to broker the deal between this headless man and her. And I have to say that I looked around seeing if anyone else had noticed that maybe we had just heard a confession to vehicular homicide, but no one seemed very fazed by this. They were just happy and taking more peyote and smiling. And so a few hours later, and after a lot more peyote, about I'd say 3 or 4 in the morning, a lot more peyote, she announced, "The shingles are gone. The spirit of the man came before me, forgave me, and I am healed." And I thought, right, well, let's revisit this in a couple of days and see really if you're healed. And so I tried to interview her later that morning, but she said she was too peyotied up. I guess that's a technical term for an interview. So I went home and I called her, I kept trying to call her, finally reached her about 2 months later. to see if the shingles really were gone, and she said, yes, indeed, they were gone. I called her 3 years later, just as I was putting the finishing touches on my book, and she said, once again, the shingles never returned after that healing ceremony. So it seems to me you're left with 3 options of what happened here. Door number 1 is that there was a medicinal property in the peyote that cured the shingles. Door number 2 is that the relief she felt from her vision reduced her stress and thus her shingles, which is, I think, what most people believe. And door number 3, she really did access a spiritual world and was healed. So peyote, which has the active ingredient of mescaline, is like other psychedelic drugs, including LSD and magic mushrooms or psilocybin, that seem to prompt a mystical experience that's very close to what the mystics describe. Scientists have now discovered that these psychedelic drugs have a couple of really interesting things in common. Chemically, they look a lot like serotonin, which is a neurotransmitter that affects the parts of the brain that relate to emotions and perception. And now scientists at Johns Hopkins University have discovered that they all target the same serotonin receptor. Bonding with that receptor allows a cascade of kind of chemical reactions that create the sight and the sound and the feeling of a mystical experience. Since the early 70s, the government banned all research on psychedelic drugs, during their war on drugs. But now, thanks to a neuropharmacologist at Hopkins named Roland Griffiths, the government's beginning to allow these studies. And this is going to open the door to understanding actually what's happening in the brains of mystics, or you and me, when we have spiritual experience. See, one of the problems of studying spiritual experience is that they're slippery little devils, I mean, you can't say, oh, I'm going to have a profound union with the universe on, Friday at 2 p.m. So why don't I go ahead and schedule a brain scan and they can look at what happens? You can't do that. I mean, these spiritual experiences happen maybe once in a lifetime, or at least, if more than randomly. You can't predict them. But soon, scientists are going to be able to give someone a capsule of psilocybin, slide them into the brain scanner, and watch the experience unfold in the brain. Now, does that mean that God is just a chemical reaction? Well, a lot of scientists would say yes, but Roland Griffiths, who's also a big meditator, he doesn't think so. For one thing, he says, isn't it just as plausible that the chemical reactions and electrical firings in the brain are reflecting an interaction with God, or the spiritual realm? And he uses this analogy. When you eat a piece of apple pie, all sorts of things happen in the brain. The part that handles smell lights up, so does the part that handles taste as you put the fork on your tongue, and probably the part that handles memory as you think about the last time you ate a piece of pie that was this good. But does the fact that there is predictable brain chemistry, brain activity, does the fact that there is that going on mean that the apple pie does not exist, that it's a figment of your imagination? Of course not. Well, maybe, he says, this brain is chronicling an activity, an interaction with the divine. Griffiths has another philosophical issue. Why? Why are we wired to have mystical experiences in the first place? I mean, is it possible that there is a God or intelligence who's created us this way so that on occasion he or she punctures the veil and communicates with us? Is there possibly a God like that? And at this point, we simply don't know. We don't know through scientific means. But I do think that there is a really fascinating debate that's circling around spiritual ideas. And I think we may be able to get an answer to that debate, one way or the other. It's the mind-brain debate, or can consciousness operate when the brain is offline? And I actually think that this debate is the open seam in the armor of materialism, right? The place where the argument that there's nothing more than this material dimension, where it just might come apart. So let me tell you one last story. In 1991, a woman named Pam Reynolds was found to have an aneurysm on her brain stem. Her doctor told her it was very large, it could rupture at any moment, and it would instantly kill her. So she decided to undergo what was then an experimental operation called a standstill operation. She flew out to Barrow Neurological Institute in Phoenix, and essentially they put her under anesthesia, taped her eyes shut, and put molded speakers in her ears that emitted loud clicks or evoked potentials 90 to 100 decibels. I've been told that's about as loud as a jet plane taking off if you're standing on the tarmac. When her brain could no longer respond to those clicks, the doctors knew that they could then proceed with the surgery. Then they lowered Pam's body temperature to 65 degrees and drained the blood out of her head like draining oil from a car. Right? The aneurysm sac closed for, it collapsed for lack of blood, and the surgeons went into her skull, snipped the aneurysm, sewed it up, and then reintroduced the blood back into her body. They raised her body temperature and brought Pam back to consciousness. It all took about 6 hours. When Pam awakened, she had a story to tell. Pam said she floated upward, which was an out-of-body experience, and watched part of the operation from just above the chief neurosurgeon's left shoulder, like she was at a rock concert, she said. She could describe what the operating theater looked like, and how many surgeons were there, and how many were male and female. She could describe the unusual-looking bone saw called a Midas Rex and the blade containers. She heard conversations, including one where a female surgeon said that Pam's arteries were too small in the left groin, so the chief neurosurgeon told her to try the right side. Then she had her typical near-death experience, you know, the tunnel, the white light, seeing dead relatives, yada, 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 yada. Okay. Now, I don't find the near-death experience interesting, or it's interesting, of course, all near-death experiences are interesting, but they're not really testable. So let's put that aside. What I find fascinating though, is Pam's ability to describe visual and auditory events during the operation when she was under deep anesthesia and her sight and hearing were blocked. And that raises the question, was Pam's mind, was her consciousness operating separately from her brain? Now, of course, I interviewed scientists who all said that this could be easily explained through material means, that she had what's called anesthesia awareness. And while she couldn't see, she could have heard what was going on and kind of created a picture in her head about what the operating room looked like and all of that. And I should say that I've heard dozens of similar stories about people who died in the operating room or who were in a car crash and, you know, essentially lifted above their car and could watch the whole scene from above. And I thought they were really interesting stories, but they weren't conclusive because it was entirely possible that their brains were still operating. And this is kind of what a brain does when it's shutting down. It creates all sorts of illusions and sensations. I'm willing to accept that all those other stories are explainable by material means. But Pam's story just feels more compelling to me. For one thing, it's corroborated. A doctor named Michael Sabom got all the hospital records and transcripts from the operation and found that, and what he found was that what Pam said happened did in fact happen when in the order that she said. The conversations were accurate. Everything she talked about was absolutely accurate. And then I interviewed this chief neurosurgeon, Robert Spetzler, who confirmed that Pam was in a deep coma, that her brain was in a hypothermic state, completely offline. She could not have heard or seen any of the operation. A brain in that state, he says, cannot form or retain memories. So I asked Dr. Spetzler, how do you explain it? And he said he had, quote, absolutely no explanation from a scientific perspective. But he said, this has changed my view of reality. In closing, I want to tell you who I wrote this book for. I wrote it for people like you and for myself who want to retain and intellectual integrity and a belief in science, and still be open to the idea that there is more than this material reality. And, you know, I guess that's a modest goal until you consider that the matter-only model, the arguments of neo-atheism, have really kind of dominated the debate for some time. I mean, Francis Crick, who co-discovered the structure of DNA, captured the sentiment of most, like 93% of elite scientists this way. You, he wrote, your joys and your sorrows, your memories and your ambitions, your sense of personal identity and free will are in fact no more than the behavior of a vast assembly of nerve cells and their associated molecules. I don't think it's as slam dunk a case as Dr. Crick and others make it out to be. I mean, sure, you can look at the evidence of some of these studies and say, God is an illusion produced by brain chemistry. But you can just as legitimately say, no, this is how our brains are finely tuned to connect with the divine. And brain chemistry, well, that's what happens when we touch the transcendent. And at this point, science can't referee this question. And there are so many other really incredible stories and now studies that seem to suggest there may be more than this material dimension. You know, later we're going to talk about the prayer studies, and it's clear that your thoughts have physical impact, surely on yourself, but maybe on others. It's clear that strange things happen on the cusp of death. Doctors and nurses all report, many of them report, for instance, that people with Alzheimer's suddenly become lucid as they approach death. And it's as if, as Bruce Grayson at UVA says, the mind is free to operate when the brain stops functioning. It's clear that when people have spiritual experiences, they are transformed psychologically in a way that nothing else transforms, not in my experience. Nothing, you know, not even a, I mean, they're transformed so fundamentally that all their ambitions change, and I think we'll talk about this later, but all their ambitions change. They're transformed physically, their hopes, their dreams, everything else. It's more powerful than, you know, a transcendent moment at the opera or say a Cowboys run at the Super Bowl. More transcendent than that, more transformative. And personally, I think that we may be on the cusp of a paradigm shift when the theory that there is nothing but matter, when that idea begins to crumble and science begins to take seriously the idea that we may be more than a vast assembly of nerve cells and molecules. And, you know, at this point, science can't prove God, but neither can it disprove God. And I think there is circumstantial evidence of God. I think it's just as rational to believe in that spiritual dimension as to dismiss it and disbelieve in it. And personally, given the choice, I'm going to believe. Thank you.